The woman's voice was so certain, so calm, that for a moment I believed her. "My husband is on his way," she said, her wrinkled hand smoothing the thin hospital blanket across her lap. "He's just parking the car. You know how he is. Always looking for the perfect spot, even when I tell him it doesn't matter." She smiled then, a soft, private smile that spoke of decades of shared jokes and familiar routines. Her eyes, pale blue, almost translucent in the harsh fluorescent light of the emergency bay, gazed past me toward the automatic doors, waiting. I was 3 hours into my shift at St. Halstead Hospital, my white coat still crisp, my stethoscope cold around my neck. It was a Wednesday afternoon in late September, that golden time of year when summer finally releases its grip and autumn begins to whisper its promises. Through the windows of the ED, I could see leaves starting to turn, touched with gold and crimson. The patient was Margaret Chen, 83 years old according to her chart, brought in by ambulance after a fall at her assisted living facility. Possible hip fracture, definitely confused, talking about people and places that the paramedics couldn't quite make sense of. "Mrs. Chen," I said gently, pulling up a stool so I could sit at her eye level. "I'm Dr. Noah Reyes. Can you tell me what happened today?" "Oh, it was silly, really," she said, her voice carrying the faint trace of an accent I couldn't quite place. British, maybe, or South African. "I was reaching for a book on the top shelf. James has been after me to stop doing that, says I should ask for help, and I lost my balance, but I'm fine, dear. Truly. I just need to wait for my husband." Behind me, I heard the automatic doors whoosh open. I turned, half expecting to see an elderly man rushing in, worried about his wife. Instead, I saw a woman in her 50s, her dark hair streaked with gray, her face tight with an emotion I couldn't immediately identify. Fear, yes, but something else too. Something that looked almost like grief. She walked straight to the bedside, her eyes locked on the elderly patient. "Mom," she said softly. "Mom, it's me, Rebecca." Margaret Chen's face lit up. "Becca? Oh, darling, you didn't need to come." "I told them I'm perfectly fine. Your father will be here any moment and he'll take me home." Rebecca's jaw tightened. She looked at me then, and I saw it clearly in her eyes. That deep, bone-tired sadness that comes from repeating the same truth over and over to someone who can't hold on to it. "Dr. Reyes," she said, reading my name tag. "Can I speak with you? Privately?" We stepped out into the hallway, leaving Margaret humming softly to herself, still watching the doors. "My father died 12 years ago," Rebecca said without preamble. "Heart attack, sudden. My mother knows this, or she did know this. For 11 years she grieved him, and then about 6 months ago she started forgetting. Small things at first, then bigger things. And now," she trailed off, her eyes filling with tears that she blinked away impatiently. "Now she thinks he's still alive. She wakes up every morning and asks where he is. I tell her the truth, and she falls apart all over again. It's like watching her lose him on repeat every single day, so the staff at her facility, they've been going along with it, telling her he's at work or running errands or on his way. It seemed kinder than breaking her heart over and over. I stood there in that fluorescent hallway, the sounds of the emergency department washing over us, monitors beeping, voices calling out, someone crying in one of the exam rooms, and I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just a hip fracture. This wasn't just another elderly patient with dementia. This was a woman living in two realities at once. In one, her husband of 50 years was alive, was parking the car, was about to walk through those doors and make everything okay. In the other, he'd been gone for more than a decade, leaving behind a hole that even memory loss couldn't fill. But what I didn't know yet, what none of us knew, was that Margaret Chen's confusion held something more than dementia. Hidden in her fragmented memories was a truth that would challenge everything I thought I understood about love, loss, and the stories we tell ourselves to survive. My name is Dr. Noah Reyes, and before that Wednesday afternoon, I thought I understood grief. I'd seen it in the emergency department at St. Halstead, families receiving devastating news, the moment when hope crumbles into anguish, the sound of crying that echoes through the corridors long after the tears have stopped. I'd lost my grandmother when I was 15, watched my mother navigate that particular sorrow that comes from losing a parent. I thought I knew what loss looked like, but I was about to learn that grief isn't a single thing. It's a shapeshifter, taking different forms depending on who's carrying it and how long they've been carrying it. And sometimes, the kindest thing the human brain can do is simply forget. St. Halstead Hospital sat in the heart of our unnamed city, like a monument to human fragility and resilience. 17 floors of glass and steel, housing every kind of human drama you could imagine. I'd been a resident here for 6 months now, assigned to the emergency department under Dr. Sarah Chen's supervision. No relation to Margaret Chen, though the coincidence of the name had made me smile when I first saw the patient's chart. Dr. Chen, my attending, was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed and sharper-minded, with a reputation for being tough but fair. She'd been an emergency medicine physician for 15 years, and in that time, she'd developed what she called her sixth sense for when something wasn't quite what it seemed. Never take the obvious answer at face value, she'd told me during my first week. A chest pain isn't always a heart attack. A headache isn't always just a headache. And confusion in an elderly patient isn't always just dementia. I thought about those words as I walked back into Margaret's room, Rebecca following close behind. The elderly woman was still humming, her fingers now tracing patterns on the blanket, her eyes still fixed on those automatic doors. "Mrs. Chen," I said, pulling my stool closer again. "I need to examine you now, okay? Make sure that fall didn't cause any serious injuries." "Of course, dear," she said pleasantly. "But you should know I'm quite hardy. James always says I'm tougher than I look." James, her husband, dead for 12 years but alive in her mind, still making jokes about her strength, still part of her present tense. I began the examination, my hands gentle as I palpated her hip. She winced when I pressed on the right side, and I felt the telltale irregularity that suggested a fracture. We'd need x-rays to confirm, possibly a CT scan. At her age, a hip fracture was serious. It could mean surgery, lengthy recovery, increased risk of complications. But as I examined her, I noticed other things, the way her eyes occasionally lost focus, as if she were looking at something I couldn't see, the slight tremor in her left hand, the bruises on her arms in various stages of healing, yellow, green, purple, suggesting multiple falls over recent weeks. "How long has your mother been living at the assisted living facility?" I asked Rebecca quietly. "About 8 months. After she left the stove on twice in 1 week and nearly started a fire the second time, I knew she couldn't live alone anymore." Rebecca's voice was heavy with guilt. "I wanted her to move in with us, but she refused. Said she couldn't leave the house where she and my father had lived together. And the memory issues, when did they start? About a year ago, maybe longer. At first, we thought it was just normal aging. She'd forget appointments, lose her keys, repeat stories. But then she started getting lost in familiar places, forgetting my name sometimes. And then the thing with Dad started." I glanced at Margaret, who was gazing out the window now, her expression peaceful. "Has she seen a neurologist?" "Yes. About 4 months ago. They did all the tests. MRI, cognitive assessments, blood work. The diagnosis was Alzheimer's, early to moderate stage. They prescribed medication, but it hasn't seemed to help much. The forgetting just keeps getting worse. Alzheimer's, the diagnosis that families dreaded. The slow theft of identity and memory. The cruel way it could turn a lifetime of experiences into scattered puzzle pieces that no longer fit together. I'd learned about it in medical school, studied the pathophysiology, memorized the stages. But knowing the science of something and understanding its human impact were two very different things." "Mrs. Chen," I said, drawing her attention back to me. "Can you tell me what year it is?" She thought for a moment. 2011, she said confidently. 14 years off. She was living in the past, in a time when her husband was still alive, when her mind was still her own. "And where are we right now?" "The hospital, obviously." A hint of irritation crept into her voice. "I'm not completely daft, young man. I had a fall and they brought me here. But really, I'm fine. I just need James to come so we can go home." Rebecca made a small sound, almost like a sob swallowed halfway. I caught her eye and saw the exhaustion there, the weight of months, maybe years, of watching her mother slip away piece by piece. "Let's get those x-rays," I said. "And I'm going to have Dr. Chen come take a look at you too. She's one of our best physicians." "That's very kind," Margaret said. "But I do hope we can do this quickly. James worries when I'm gone too long." As the nurses came to take Margaret for imaging, I pulled Rebecca aside once more. "I know this is difficult," I said, "but I need you to tell me everything you can about your mother's medical history. Any other conditions, medications she's taking, any changes in behavior beyond the memory loss." Rebecca nodded, pulling out her phone. "I keep notes. Let me see." As she scrolled through her records, I found myself thinking about my own parents. My father, with his early morning rituals and his careful routines. My mother, with her sharp memory for every detail of our family history. What would it be like to watch them lose themselves? To see the people who raised you become strangers to their own lives? She's on donepezil for the Alzheimer's, Rebecca was saying. Blood pressure medication, lisinopril, baby aspirin, vitamin D. She has mild arthritis, controlled with over-the-counter pain relievers, no history of strokes or seizures, no diabetes. I made notes, building the clinical picture, but there was something nagging at me, some detail that didn't quite fit. You said the confusion about your father started about 6 months ago? Yes, why? The Alzheimer's was diagnosed 4 months ago, so the confusion started before the diagnosis? Well, yes. The confusion was why we took her to the neurologist in the first place. And before that, before the confusion about your father, was she grieving normally? I mean, had she accepted his death? Rebecca's expression shifted, became more complicated. That's actually a good question. After Dad died, Mom fell apart, completely. We were worried she might not survive the grief, but then, after a few months, she seemed to come back to herself. She talked about him in past tense, kept his pictures up, visited his grave every week. For 11 years, she did all the normal widow things. And then suddenly, 6 months ago, she started acting like he was still alive? Yes, it was like a switch flipped. One day she knew he was gone. The next day, she was setting 2 places at the table and asking when he'd be home from work. I felt that familiar tingle, the one I got when something in a case didn't add up. Alzheimer's caused progressive memory loss, yes, but typically, distant memories were preserved longer than recent ones. It was unusual for someone to forget a major event from 12 years ago while retaining other long-term memories. Dr. Reyes? Rebecca looked at me with concern. What is it? I'm not sure yet, but I'd like to do some additional testing beyond the hip. With your permission, I'd like to run a more comprehensive workup. Blood tests, another look at her brain imaging, maybe consult with neurology. You think there's something else wrong, beyond the Alzheimer's? I think, I said carefully, that we should make sure we're not missing anything. Confusion in elderly patients can have many causes, and sometimes they overlap in unexpected ways. Rebecca nodded slowly. Okay, yes, do whatever tests you need to do. I just want to know what's really happening with my mother. What we didn't know yet, what wouldn't become clear for hours still, was that Margaret Chen's confusion wasn't just about neurodegenerative disease. Hidden in her blood work, invisible to the eye but devastating in its effects, was something else entirely. Something treatable. Something that had been slowly poisoning her reality for months. But first, we had to find it. The x-rays came back showing exactly what I'd suspected. A fractured femoral neck, the kind of hip fracture that typically required surgical intervention. Margaret would need to be admitted, would need orthopedic consultation, would likely need surgery within the next 24 hours. But as I reviewed the images with Dr. Sarah Chen, my attending, I brought up my concerns about the cognitive symptoms. The timeline bothers me, I explained. Sudden onset of confusion about a major life event starting 6 months ago. That's not typical Alzheimer's progression. Dr. Chen tilted her head, studying Margaret's chart on the computer screen. What are you thinking? Delirium superimposed on dementia? Maybe. Or something else causing cognitive symptoms that was misattributed to Alzheimer's. The neurologist did an MRI 4 months ago. Let's pull those images and review them. Dr. Chen's fingers flew across the keyboard, accessing the hospital's shared imaging database. Within moments, the brain scans filled the screen. We studied them together, looking at the gray and white structures of Margaret Chen's brain. There was some atrophy, yes. Shrinkage that was typical for her age and consistent with early Alzheimer's. But nothing dramatic. Nothing that screamed advanced dementia. Run a full metabolic panel, Dr. Chen said decisively. CBC, comprehensive metabolic panel, thyroid function, B12 level, folate, RPR. And let's check ammonia, heavy metals if there's any exposure history. You think there's a metabolic cause? I think we'd be foolish not to look. Confusion in the elderly has dozens of potential causes. Alzheimer's is common, but it's not the only answer. And if there's something treatable hiding underneath, we owe it to this patient to find it. I nodded, already pulling out the order forms. This was why I'd wanted to train under Dr. Chen. She never settled for the easy answer. She dug deeper, looked harder, questioned everything. By the time I returned to Margaret's room, the orthopedic team had already been by. Dr. James Morrison, the ortho resident on call, had examined her and confirmed the need for surgery. We'll take her to the OR tomorrow morning, he told Rebecca. Hip fracture repair, Probably a partial hip replacement given her age and the fracture pattern. It's a routine procedure, relatively speaking, though at 83 there are always risks. Rebecca nodded, her face pale. And after the surgery? Rehab, physical therapy, probably a few weeks before she's mobile again. Given her living situation and cognitive state, she'll likely need to stay at a skilled nursing facility during recovery. Not back to her assisted living place? Not immediately. She'll need more intensive care at first. Dr. Morrison's voice was kind but firm. This was the hard truth that came with hip fractures in elderly patients. They often marked a permanent decline in independence. After Dr. Morrison left, I approached Rebecca. I've ordered some additional blood tests. We should have results in a few hours. What are you looking for? Anything that might be contributing to your mother's confusion. There are metabolic issues, vitamin deficiencies, even infections that can cause cognitive symptoms. I want to make sure we're not missing something treatable. Rebecca's eyes filled with sudden hope. You mean she might not have Alzheimer's? Or that it might not be as bad as they thought? I held up a cautionary hand. I'm not saying that. The Alzheimer's diagnosis may be correct, but sometimes patients have multiple things going on at once. If there's something else we can treat, it might improve her cognitive function, even if it doesn't cure the underlying dementia. It was important to be honest, to not give false hope, but I could see what my words meant to Rebecca. The possibility, however small, that her mother's confusion might be partially reversible. Margaret was dozing now, the pain medication the nurses had given her finally taking effect. In sleep, she looked younger somehow, her face relaxed, the worry lines smoothed away, her left hand rested on the blanket, and I noticed she wore a simple gold wedding band, worn thin from decades of wear. Tell me about your father, I said to Rebecca quietly. What was he like? Rebecca smiled, a real smile for the first time since she'd arrived. James Chen. Everyone called him Jim. She paused, searching for words. He was steady, calm. When my mother got anxious or worried, he'd just put his hand on her shoulder and say, "It'll work itself out, Maggie." And somehow it always did. What did he do? He was an accountant. Not the most exciting profession, but he loved it. He loved the orderliness of numbers, the way everything had to balance in the end. He was meticulous about everything. His clothes, his car, their finances. Drove my mother crazy sometimes, but she loved him for it. And they were happy. Their marriage? Completely. They met when they were both 19, married at 21. 53 years of marriage when he died. They had their disagreements like any couple, but they were a team. When Dad died, Mom said it was like losing half of herself. She wasn't exaggerating. I thought about that. 53 years of shared life, of waking up next to the same person, of building a history together so complete that losing it would feel like losing your own identity. Did your father have any health issues before his heart attack? Not really. He had slightly elevated cholesterol, took a statin. That was it. The heart attack came out of nowhere. He was at home, reading the newspaper in his favorite chair. Mom was in the kitchen making dinner. He called out to her, said he didn't feel well, and by the time she got to him, he was unconscious. The paramedics said he was probably gone before he hit the floor. Massive MI. A sudden death. No warning, no chance for goodbyes. In some ways, that was merciful. No suffering, no prolonged decline. But for the person left behind, it meant no preparation, no gradual adjustment to the coming loss. I'm sorry, I said. That must have been devastating for your whole family. It was, but Mom bore the brunt of it. My brother lives in California, I live across town. We supported her as much as we could, but at the end of the day, she was the one going home to an empty house every night. The one sleeping in a bed that suddenly felt too big. The one setting a table for one instead of two. Margaret stirred then, her eyes fluttering open. James? She murmured. Is that you? Rebecca's face crumpled slightly before she composed herself. No, Mom, it's me, Becca. Oh. Margaret's expression shifted from hope to confusion. Where's James? He should be here by now. He's been delayed, Rebecca said, her voice carefully neutral. But you're in the hospital, Mom. You broke your hip. They're going to fix it tomorrow. Broken hip? How silly of me. Margaret's laugh was light, unbothered. James will tease me about this for weeks. You know how he is. I watched Rebecca's face as she smiled and nodded, going along with the fiction, and I wondered, which was crueler, to repeatedly shatter the illusion with truth, forcing her mother to relive her husband's death over and over, or to maintain the lie, to live in a world where a dead man was always on his way, perpetually expected but never arriving. There was no good answer. This was the impossible choice that Alzheimer's families faced every day. My pager buzzed. The lab results were starting to come back. I need to check on something, I told Rebecca. I'll be back soon. I headed to the workstation where Dr. Chen was already reviewing the results on a computer screen. As I approached, I saw her expression, focused, intense, the look she got when she'd found something significant. "Noah," she said without looking up, "come look at this." I leaned over her shoulder, scanning the lab values. Most were normal. Kidney function fine, liver function fine, electrolytes balanced. But then I saw it, highlighted in red because it was outside the normal range. Calcium level, 12.8 mg/dL. Normal range was 8.5 to 10.5. Hypercalcemia, I said. Significant hypercalcemia, Dr. Chen corrected. That level can definitely cause confusion, cognitive impairment, even personality changes. And look at this. She clicked to another tab. Her PTH is elevated too. Parathyroid hormone. My mind raced through the differential diagnosis. Elevated calcium and elevated PTH together suggested primary hyperparathyroidism. Overactive parathyroid glands producing too much hormone, causing the body to pull calcium from bones and raising blood calcium levels. How long has this been going on? I wondered aloud. Good question. Let's look at her old records. Dr. Chen pulled up Margaret's historical labs from the assisted living facility. Look, 6 months ago, her calcium was 11.2. 8 months ago, 10.9. It's been creeping up slowly, 6 months ago. Right when the confusion about her husband had started. The hyperparathyroidism is causing her cognitive symptoms, I said, the pieces clicking together, or at least contributing to them significantly. And it's been missed because everyone assumed it was just Alzheimer's, Dr. Chen finished. This is exactly why we always run a full metabolic workup on confused elderly patients. Cognitive impairment has a differential diagnosis like anything else. I felt a surge of excitement mixed with anger. Excitement because we'd found something treatable. Anger because Margaret Chen had been suffering for months with a condition that could have been identified and addressed. What's the treatment? Surgery, typically. Remove the overactive parathyroid gland or glands. It's usually caused by a benign adenoma. Once you remove it, calcium levels normalize, and the cognitive symptoms often improve significantly. Often? Not always? Dr. Chen's expression sobered. If the hypercalcemia has been severe and prolonged, it can cause permanent changes. And if there really is underlying Alzheimer's as well, treating the hyperparathyroidism won't cure that. But it should help, maybe significantly. I thought about Rebecca's desperate hope, about Margaret's peaceful delusion, about James Chen, who had been dead for 12 years but lived on in his wife's confused mind. We need to tell them, I said. We do. But Noah, manage expectations. This isn't a miracle cure. At best, it might bring back some clarity, might ease the confusion. But her husband will still be dead. The grief she's been avoiding by forgetting, she might have to face it all over again. The weight of that settled on me. We were about to offer Margaret Chen a partial return to reality, but reality in this case included devastating loss. Were we doing her a favor? Or were we condemning her to relive her worst grief? We still have to tell them, I said. They deserve to know. Agreed. Let's go. Rebecca's face transformed as Dr. Chen explained what we'd found. First hope, bright and fierce, then confusion, then a complicated mixture of emotions I couldn't quite parse. So the confusion might not be Alzheimer's? She asked, gripping the edge of her mother's hospital bed. It might be both, Dr. Chen said carefully. We don't know yet. The elevated calcium is definitely contributing to her cognitive symptoms. Hypercalcemia can cause confusion, memory problems, personality changes, fatigue. But that doesn't rule out early Alzheimer's. They may be concurrent conditions. But if you fix the calcium problem, she'll likely have improved mental clarity. How much improvement? We won't know until we treat it. And Rebecca, Dr. Chen's voice was gentle but firm. You need to understand what improved mental clarity might mean for your mother. Rebecca's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Right now, your mother is confused about many things, including your father's death. She's living in a reality where he's still alive. That's painful for you, but for her, it might be protective. If we treat the hypercalcemia and her confusion clears, understanding dawned on Rebecca's face, followed immediately by anguish. She'll remember that he's dead. She'll have to grieve him all over again. Possibly. We can't predict exactly how her cognition will change. But yes, that's a real possibility. Margaret stirred in her bed, drawn by the sound of voices. Becca? What's wrong, darling? You look upset. Nothing, Mom. The doctors just found something that might help you feel better. Better? I feel fine. I just want to go home. Margaret's eyes drifted to the window, where afternoon light was fading into evening. James will be worried. We had plans tonight. Wednesday is our night. We always watch our shows together and have tea. Rebecca closed her eyes briefly, and I saw a tear escape down her cheek. Mrs. Chen, I said, sitting down on the stool beside her bed, we found something in your blood tests. Your calcium level is too high. That can make you feel confused, can affect your memory and thinking. My calcium? Margaret looked puzzled. But I drink milk. James makes sure I do. He says we need strong bones at our age. It's not about dietary calcium, Dr. Chen explained. It's about your parathyroid glands, small glands in your neck that regulate calcium. One or more of them is overactive, producing too much hormone and raising your calcium too high. We can fix it with surgery. Surgery? Margaret's expression became anxious. Oh, I don't know about surgery. That sounds serious. I should discuss it with James first. The room fell silent. This was the impossible circle. Margaret needed her husband's input for a major decision, but her husband was dead, and the very condition we were trying to treat was preventing her from remembering that fact. Mom, Rebecca said, her voice thick with emotion, I can help you make this decision. The doctors say this surgery could help you think more clearly. But James should be here. He's better at these medical things. Where is he? Why isn't he here yet? Margaret's voice rose with agitation. He promised he'd come. He always comes. Something must be wrong. What if something happened to him? And there it was. Even in her confusion, some part of Margaret knew. Some deep part of her brain recognized the absence, felt the wrongness of her husband's perpetual non-arrival. The delusion wasn't perfect. It had cracks. Nothing's wrong, Rebecca said, her voice breaking. Everything's fine. Your husband, She looked at Dr. Chen helplessly. What was the right answer? Continue the lie to keep her mother calm? Tell the truth and watch her fall apart? Dr. Chen made the decision. Mrs. Chen, your husband would want you to get the care you need. This surgery could help you feel better, help your mind clear. We can repair your hip at the same time. It's the best course of action. Margaret studied Dr. Chen's face for a long moment. You're a good doctor, she said finally. I can tell. You remind me of James. He has that same way of being calm and certain. She paused. All right, if you think it's necessary, I'll do it. But I want James to know. Someone needs to tell him where I am. We'll make sure he knows, Rebecca said softly, though her voice was heavy with the weight of impossible promises. As the evening wore on, I found myself returning to Margaret's room between other patients. I couldn't quite explain why. She wasn't critically ill, her care plan was established, and the night shift would be taking over soon. But something about her case had gotten under my skin. Maybe it was the way she looked out the window in the quiet moments, her expression expectant and patient, waiting for someone who would never arrive. Maybe it was Rebecca's exhausted grief, the burden of watching her mother lose herself piece by piece. Or maybe it was the question that kept nagging at me. If we could give Margaret back her clarity, should we? Around 8 o'clock, I found Rebecca in the family waiting room, clutching a cup of coffee and staring at nothing. Can I sit? I asked. She nodded, and I sank into the chair beside her. The waiting room was empty except for us, decorated in those soothing colors that hospitals favor. Soft blues and gentle grays, as if pastel walls could cushion the blow of bad news. I don't know what to hope for, Rebecca said suddenly. Is that terrible? I don't know whether I want this treatment to work or not. That's not terrible, I said. It's honest. If it works, if she remembers that Dad is gone, she'll be devastated. She'll have to live with that knowledge again, that pain. For the past 6 months, she's been happy. Confused, yes, but happy. She's been living in a world where my father is alive, where she's waiting for him to come home, where any minute now he'll walk through the door. That's a gentler reality than the one where he's been dead for 12 years. But it's not real, I said gently. Does that matter? If it feels real to her, if it brings her comfort, does it matter that it's not true? Rebecca turned to look at me, her eyes searching. You're a doctor. You deal in facts, in measurable realities. But what's more important, objective truth or subjective comfort? It was a question that went beyond medicine, touched on philosophy and ethics, and the fundamental question of what makes a life worth living. I think, I said slowly, that truth matters because it allows us to make informed choices. Your mother can't make real decisions about her life if she doesn't understand her actual circumstances. And there's a cost to living in a false reality, even a comforting one. She's waiting for someone who will never come. That's a kind of suffering too. But conscious grief is worse, Rebecca countered. I know what it looks like when she remembers. I've seen it happen on bad days, when reality breaks through the confusion. She falls apart. She sobs. She says she doesn't want to live without him. Is that better than peaceful delusion? I didn't have a good answer. The truth was, medicine often presented these impossible choices between quality of life and quantity, between harsh truth and gentle fiction, between the reality we have and the one we wish for. What did your father think about these things? I asked. Did he ever talk about what he'd want if something like this happened? Rebecca smiled sadly. Dad was a practical man. He had advanced directives, DNR orders, all his affairs in order. He didn't believe in prolonging suffering. But this? I don't think he ever imagined this specific situation. What about your mother? Did she ever express wishes about medical care, about how she'd want to be treated if she developed dementia? She did, actually. About 5 years ago, after a friend of hers was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, Mom sat us down and told us that if she ever lost her mind, she didn't want to be kept alive artificially. She said she'd rather die as herself than live as a stranger. Rebecca's voice dropped to a whisper. But she also said she couldn't imagine living without my father. She said when he died, half of her died too. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of those words hanging between us. There's something I should tell you, Rebecca said finally. Something I haven't told anyone, not even my brother. I waited, letting her find her words. About 2 months after Dad died, I found my mother in the garage. She had the car running, the garage door closed. She was just sitting there in the driver's seat, not moving. I got to her in time, made her come inside. She swore it was an accident, that she'd just been confused about something. But I knew what she'd been trying to do. My breath caught. She tried to kill herself. She couldn't live without him, or she didn't want to. For months after that, I was terrified. I called her multiple times a day, drove by her house constantly, convinced that I'd find her dead. And then, gradually, she seemed to get better. She started going out again, seeing friends, talking about the future. I thought she'd made it through the worst of the grief. And now I wonder if the confusion, the Alzheimer's, or whatever it is, might have been her brain's way of protecting her. If she couldn't handle the reality of his death, maybe forgetting was the only way she could survive. Rebecca looked at me with haunted eyes. So when you tell me you can clear away the confusion, make her remember reality again, I have to ask, are we healing her? Or are we taking away the only coping mechanism that's kept her alive? The next morning, Margaret Chen went into surgery. First, the hip. Dr. Morrison and his team performed the hip replacement, while Margaret was under general anesthesia. Then, while she was still sedated, Dr. Patricia Alvarez, the endocrine surgeon, made a small incision in Margaret's neck and removed the enlarged parathyroid gland that had been causing all the trouble. I wasn't in the OR. Residents didn't observe surgeries outside their direct training unless specifically invited, but I found myself checking the OR board obsessively throughout the morning, watching the status updates. Hip replacement complete. Parathyroid surgery in progress. Closing. Recovery. By early afternoon, Margaret was in the post-anesthesia care unit, still groggy from the anesthesia, but stable. Rebecca sat beside her bed, holding her mother's hand, her expression a mixture of hope and dread. How long until we know? She asked when I stopped by to check on them. How long until we know if the surgery worked, if she'll be clearer? Her calcium levels should start dropping within 24 hours, I explained. But cognitive improvement can take longer. Days, possibly weeks. The brain needs time to recover from prolonged hypercalcemia, and we won't know how much underlying Alzheimer's there is until the calcium issue is resolved. So, we wait. We wait, I confirmed. Margaret opened her eyes then, blinking slowly in the harsh recovery room lights. Rebecca, her voice was hoarse from the breathing tube. What happened? Where am I? You had surgery, Mom. On your hip and on your neck. You're okay. Everything went well. Surgery. Margaret's brow furrowed. I don't remember. James? Where's James? Did he wait for me? Rebecca's face fell, still confused then, still living in the false reality where her husband was alive and present. But something in Margaret's tone was different. There was uncertainty there, a questioning quality that hadn't been there before, as if she was starting to doubt her own certainty about James's imminent arrival. Rest now, Mom, Rebecca said gently. Just rest. Over the next 2 days, I checked on Margaret Chen whenever I could. It became a ritual of sorts. I'd stop by her room in the orthopedic ward, review her labs, check her incisions, and watch for signs of cognitive change. Her calcium level dropped steadily, 11.2, then 10.4, then 9.8, into the normal range. Her physical recovery from the hip surgery progressed well. She was working with physical therapy, learning to use a walker, her pain controlled with medication. But her mental state remained unchanged. She still asked for James multiple times a day, still waited for him to visit, still lived in that liminal space where her husband was alive but absent, always about to arrive but never quite appearing. Rebecca's exhaustion deepened. She practically lived at the hospital, leaving only to shower and change clothes. Dark circles appeared under her eyes. Her clothes began to hang loose, food forgotten in the stress of waiting. "You need to take care of yourself," I told her on the third day after surgery. "Your mother's going to need you to be strong when she comes out of this." "If she comes out of it," Rebecca said bitterly. "Maybe this is just who she is now. Maybe that neurologist was right and it is Alzheimer's, and we've put her through 2 surgeries for nothing." "The hyperparathyroidism was real," I reminded her. "Even if her cognitive function doesn't fully return, treating it will prevent other complications. Kidney stones, bone loss, cardiovascular issues. We did the right thing." "Did we?" She looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. "Or did we just medicalize a coping mechanism that was keeping her alive and sane?" I didn't have an answer to that. Dr. Chen found me at the nurse's station late that afternoon, reviewing Margaret's latest labs for the 3rd time, as if the numbers would tell me something different than they had the previous 2 times I'd looked. "You're getting attached," she observed. "I'm following up on my patient," I said, but we both knew it was more than that. "Why this case, Noah? What is it about this patient that's gotten under your skin?" I thought about her question. "My grandmother died when I was 15, I said finally. "Stroke. Sudden, like Margaret's husband. One day she was there, teaching me to make tamales in her kitchen. The next day she was gone. I remember my grandfather at the funeral. He just stood there, silent, like he'd forgotten how to speak. He lived another 8 years, but he was never the same. It was like half of him died with her." Dr. Chen nodded slowly. "And you're wondering if forgetting might have been kinder, isn't it? If grief is that devastating, if losing someone can break you that completely, maybe forgetting is mercy. Maybe Margaret's brain was protecting her from pain she couldn't survive. Maybe," Dr. Chen agreed. "Or maybe forgetting is just a different kind of death. When we lose our memories, we lose the story of who we are. Margaret lost 12 years of her life, 12 years of growth and adaptation, and becoming someone who could survive without her husband. The confused Margaret is still back in 2011, still a wife waiting for her husband, still unchanged by grief and time. Is that really living?" "But she was happy," I protested. "Was she? She's been waiting for someone who never comes. Day after day, waiting and wondering why he's late, where he is, if something's wrong. That's not peace, Noah. That's suspended animation. That's being stuck in an endless present where the person you love is always about to arrive but never does." I thought about that. The special torture of eternal waiting, of hope that never quite dies but never gets fulfilled. "When do we consider her treatment a failure?" I asked. "How long do we wait before we accept that the cognitive improvement isn't coming?" "Another week at least, maybe 2. The brain can be slow to recover from chronic metabolic disturbances. But Noah," she fixed me with a serious look, "you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that she won't improve much, that the Alzheimer's diagnosis was correct and the hyperparathyroidism was just making it worse. If that's the case, we've helped her, but we haven't cured her." That night, I called my parents. My mother answered on the 2nd ring, her voice warm and familiar. "Noah, how are you, mijo?" "I'm good, Mama. Tired but good. How are you and Papa?" "We're fine. Your father is watching his telenovelas. You know how he is." I could hear the smile in her voice. "But you didn't call just to ask how we are. What's wrong?" Mothers always knew. "I have a patient," I said. "An elderly woman with dementia. She's forgotten that her husband died 12 years ago. She thinks he's still alive, that he's about to visit her. And I was thinking about Abuela's death, about how hard it was for Abuelo." There was a long pause. "Your grandfather," my mother said slowly, "was never the same after she died. You're right about that. But he also did something beautiful with his grief. He volunteered at the senior center, teaching other men how to cook. He said that your grandmother had taught him, and he wanted to pass that knowledge on. He stayed connected to life, even though the person who made life meaningful to him was gone. But what if he'd been able to forget, to not carry that pain? Then he wouldn't have been able to carry the love either, mijo." The pain and the love are inseparable. When we lose someone, we grieve because we love them. If we forget them, we lose both the pain and the love. Is that really better? I thought about Margaret, asking for James day after day. Was she holding on to love, or was she trapped by it? I don't know, Mama, I admitted. I thought medicine would be more straightforward than this. You have a problem, you fix it. But it's not that simple. Life is never that simple, she said gently. But that's what makes you a good doctor, Noah. You understand that every patient is a person with a story, not just a collection of symptoms. Don't lose that, even when the answers aren't clear. On the 5th day after surgery, something changed. I was doing morning rounds when I stopped by Margaret's room. She was sitting in the chair by the window, dressed in her own clothes. Rebecca had brought them from the assisted living facility and looking out at the city below. Physical therapy was going well. She was using the walker with increasing confidence, though she still needed assistance. "Good morning, Mrs. Chen," I said. "How are you feeling today?" She turned to look at me, and something in her expression was different, sharper, more present. "Dr. Reyes," she said, and there was no hesitation in her voice, no confusion about my name. "I've been thinking." "About what?" "About James." She looked back out the window. "He hasn't come to visit me. Not once since I've been here. That's not like him. That's not like him at all." My heart rate picked up. "No? No. When I had my appendix out 30 years ago, he practically lived at the hospital. Drove the nurses crazy, constantly asking about my care, making sure I had everything I needed. He wouldn't have stayed away this long." I pulled up the stool and sat down carefully. "What do you think that means?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "I think," she said slowly, "that something is wrong. I think I've been confused about something. I can't quite..." She pressed her fingers to her temples. "There's something I'm supposed to remember, something important, but it's like trying to see through fog." "Take your time," I said gently. "There's no rush." "Rebecca has been crying," Margaret continued. "I've seen her. She tries to hide it, but I'm her mother. I know." "Why is she crying? What's happened that I can't remember?" This was the moment. The fog was lifting. Margaret was starting to question her own reality, starting to sense that something was wrong with her understanding of the world. "Mrs. Chen," I said carefully, "what's the last clear thing you remember? Before coming to the hospital, what do you remember about your life?" She thought for a moment. "James and I were planning a trip to England. I wanted to go back to see where I grew up. We were looking at dates, trying to figure out when to go." Her eyes focused on something distant. When was that? "What year do you think it is?" She faltered. "It should be 2011, but that's wrong, isn't it? It's not 2011. "No," I said gently. "It's 2025. The color drained from her face. 2025. 14 years. She looked down at her hands, as if seeing them for the first time. The age spots, the prominent veins, the thinness of her skin. "I'm 83 years old." "Yes. And James." Her voice was barely a whisper. "James would be 84. I waited, letting her work through it. "He's not coming, is he?" Margaret looked at me with eyes that were suddenly devastatingly clear. "He's dead. James is dead." "Yes," I said. "I'm so sorry, but yes. He passed away 12 years ago." I watched as the truth settled over her, as 14 years of missing memories tried to force their way back into her consciousness. Her face went through a series of expressions: confusion, denial, comprehension, and finally, a grief so profound it seemed to age her further right before my eyes. "A heart attack," she said. It wasn't a question. The memory was coming back. "He was in his chair, reading the paper. He called out to me and then he was gone. That's what your daughter told me." Margaret's hands began to shake. "I've lost 12 years. 12 years of my life. Just gone. What happened? Where have I been? You've been living with memory problems. Alzheimer's disease possibly, though we're still evaluating. And you had a condition called hyperparathyroidism that was making your confusion worse. We've treated that now. Your mind is starting to clear. But I thought he was alive." Her voice broke. "For how long? How long have I been confused like this? Your daughter says about 6 months. 6 months of waiting for him to come home. 6 months of thinking he was just delayed, that he'd be here soon. 6 months of..." She stopped, her breath coming in short gasps. Oh God, Rebecca. She's been dealing with this, watching me forget, watching me ask for him over and over." She started to cry then, deep, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. I wanted to offer comfort, but I also knew that sometimes grief needs to be felt. needs to run its course without interference. The door opened, and Rebecca rushed in, clearly having been alerted by the nurses to her mother's distress. "Mom? Mom, what's wrong?" Margaret looked up at her daughter, and Rebecca froze. There was recognition in Margaret's eyes, full, complete recognition. Not just of who Rebecca was, but of everything that had happened. "Becca," Margaret said through her tears. "Oh, my darling, I'm so sorry you had to go through this." Rebecca's eyes widened. "Mom, you remember? I remember that your father is dead. I remember that I've been confused. I don't remember everything. There are still gaps, still pieces missing. But I remember the most important thing. I remember that he's gone." Rebecca sank into the chair beside her mother, and they held each other, both crying now. I stood up quietly, ready to give them privacy, but Margaret reached out and caught my hand. "Thank you," she said. "I know this might not feel like a gift right now, but thank you for bringing me back to reality, even if reality is painful." I nodded, not trusting my voice, and slipped out of the room. In the hallway, I found Dr. Chen waiting. She'd clearly been monitoring the situation. "The fog lifted," I said. "I heard. How is she?" "Grieving, remembering, devastated, but clear." I paused. "Did we do the right thing?" Dr. Chen put a hand on my shoulder. "We treated a medical condition. We gave her back her mental clarity. What she does with that clarity, how she processes this grief, and that's up to her. But she gets to make her own choices now, with full understanding of her reality. That matters, Noah. Even if the reality is unbearable, especially then. Because here's what you need to understand about grief." Dr. Chen's expression was serious. "Grief isn't the enemy. Grief is the price we pay for love. When we love someone deeply and lose them, grief is inevitable. Trying to avoid it, to forget it, to medicate it away, that's not healing. That's just postponing the inevitable." "But she tried to kill herself after he died," Rebecca told me. "What if giving her back her memory means she tries again? Then we'll watch her carefully. We'll get her the support she needs, psychiatric consultation, grief counseling, medication if necessary. But we can't make medical decisions based on the fear of what a patient might do. We have to treat the conditions we can identify and trust that with proper support, people can survive even devastating grief." I thought about my grandfather, living 8 years after my grandmother's death. He'd survived. He'd found a way to go on, to make meaning from loss. Maybe Margaret could too. Over the next 3 days, I watched Margaret Chen's mental clarity continue to improve. Her calcium levels normalized completely. More memories returned. Not all of them, but enough. She remembered the funeral, the grief, the long, lonely years after James's death. She remembered her friends rallying around her, remembered eventually returning to her routines, remembered the slow, painful process of learning to live alone, and she remembered the confusion starting, the moments when she'd forget James was gone, when she'd catch herself setting 2 places at the table or calling out to him in another room. She remembered how those moments had become more frequent, how the past had begun to bleed into the present. It was easier to forget, she told me one afternoon. We were alone in her room, Rebecca having gone home to finally get some real sleep. When I started forgetting, part of me was relieved. I didn't have to carry the pain anymore. I didn't have to wake up every morning and remember all over again that he was gone. "But you weren't happy," I observed. "Even in your confusion, you were waiting for him. You were anxious about why he wasn't coming." "That's true," she considered this. "But the anxiety of waiting is different from the grief of knowing. Waiting has hope in it. Even if that hope is misplaced, grief has only absence." "What do you want now?" I asked. "Now that you remember, now that you have clarity, what do you want for your future?" Margaret looked out the window at the city she'd lived in for more than 50 years. "I want to finish grieving him properly. I want to visit his grave. I haven't been there in months," Rebecca says. "I want to sort through our things, all the memories we built together. I want to cry when I need to cry and remember when I need to remember. And then," she paused, "then I want to figure out how to live whatever time I have left as myself, not as half of a couple." "That sounds like a good plan, but I'm scared," she admitted. "The Alzheimer's or whatever is wrong with my mind, it's still there, isn't it? Fixing my calcium levels helped, but it didn't cure me. I'd been expecting this question. We'll need to do more testing to know for sure. But yes, there are likely still some memory issues. We'll need to work with neurology to figure out the best treatment plan going forward. And I'll forget again. Maybe not today, maybe not next week, but eventually I'll forget again. I'll lose this clarity I have now. Maybe." We don't know how fast the progression will be, or if the medications can slow it down." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that took my breath away. "I want to write it down. Everything I remember about James, about our life together, about how much I loved him. I want to write it all down before I forget again. That way, even if my mind goes, even if I can't remember, there will be a record. Rebecca will have it. Our grandchildren will have it. The love won't be lost, even if my memory of it is." "That's beautiful," I said. "Will you help me? Not with the writing, that I need to do myself, but will you help me stay clear long enough to do it? Will you work with me and my doctors to give me as much time as possible before the fog comes back?" "Of course. Absolutely." She reached out and took my hand. "You know, when I was confused, when I thought James was coming to visit me, I wasn't entirely wrong. He is here, in a way. Not physically, not actually, but in my memories, in my heart, in the way I think and speak and move through the world. 53 years of marriage doesn't just disappear because one person dies. It becomes part of who you are. That's a lovely way to think about it. I should have let myself remember that from the beginning. After he died, I should have let myself feel it all. The pain, yes, but also the joy of having loved him, the gratitude for all those years together. Instead, I tried to avoid the pain, and in doing so, I nearly lost the love too." Rebecca came back that evening carrying her laptop and a small notebook. "Mom told me about her project," she said, writing down her memories. "I want to help." For the next week, Margaret worked on her memoir. Rebecca helped her type when her hands got tired, prompted her with questions when she got stuck. I stopped by whenever I could, fascinated by the process, by the way Margaret was excavating her own history before it slipped away. She wrote about meeting James at a university dance, both of them so young and uncertain. She wrote about their wedding, small and simple because they couldn't afford anything elaborate. She wrote about the birth of their children, about Rebecca and her brother, about the joy and terror of becoming parents. She wrote about ordinary days, James reading the paper while she cooked breakfast, their evening walks around the neighborhood, the way he'd always kiss her forehead before leaving for work. She wrote about arguments and reconciliations, about financial struggles and career disappointments, about aging together and watching their bodies change while their love remained constant. And she wrote about his death, the suddenness of it, the shock, the feeling that the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. She wrote about the funeral, about standing beside his casket and thinking she couldn't possibly survive this loss. She wrote about the months of grief that followed, about considering suicide, about the moment when she decided to live not because she wanted to, but because James would have wanted her to. "I'm including the dark parts too," she told me. "The depression, the suicidal thoughts, the confusion that started this whole thing." Rebecca was worried it would be too heavy, too dark for the grandchildren to read someday, but I think it's important. I think it's important for them to know that love isn't always light and easy. Sometimes love means carrying tremendous pain and choosing to go on anyway. Dr. Chen came to visit Margaret during this time. It wasn't standard practice for an ED attending to follow up with patients after they'd been admitted, but Dr. Chen had been following the case with interest. "You're doing important work," Dr. Chen told Margaret. "This memoir you're writing, it's medicine too, in its own way. You're creating meaning from your experience, and that's one of the most powerful healing tools we have." "Do you think I'm being selfish?" Margaret asked, "taking this time to write instead of just enjoying what clarity I have left?" "I think," Dr. Chen said, "that you're being wise. You're using your present to honor your past and create something for your future, even if that future might not include clear memories. That takes courage." Margaret smiled. "I had a good teacher. James always said that when you're facing something difficult, the best thing to do is take action. Do something concrete, something useful. So that's what I'm doing." Margaret Chen was discharged from the hospital 2 weeks after her surgery. Her hip was healing well, she was mobile with a walker, and her mental clarity had stabilized. She wasn't perfect. She still had moments of confusion, still sometimes forgot where she was or what day it was. But the profound disorientation about her husband's death had resolved. She knew James was gone. She grieved him consciously now, with full awareness. And while that knowledge brought pain, it also brought something else, the ability to move forward. "I'm going to a different assisted living facility," she told me on her last day in the hospital. "One that has better memory care services. Rebecca found a place that has both independent living and memory support, so when I need more help, I can transition without having to move again." "That sounds perfect. And I've arranged for grief counseling. I should have done it 12 years ago, but better late than never, right? She smiled, but there was sadness in her eyes. I'm also going to start attending a support group for people with Alzheimer's and their families. Rebecca will come with me. We need to learn how to navigate this together. Rebecca stood beside her mother's bed, packing the last of Margaret's belongings. She looked better than she had in weeks, rested, clearer, some of the weight lifted from her shoulders. Having my mom back, even if it's not perfect, even if it won't last forever, it's a gift, Rebecca told me quietly while Margaret was saying goodbye to the nursing staff. These past 2 weeks, we've talked more honestly than we have in years. About Dad, about grief, about what she wants for her remaining time. It's been painful, but it's been real. That matters more than I can express. What happens when the Alzheimer's progresses? I asked. When the confusion comes back, then we'll deal with it. But this time, we'll do it with full medical care, with psychiatric support, with a care team that understands both the dementia and the grief. We won't mistake one for the other, and we won't let treatable conditions go untreated. She paused. And we have the memoir. Whatever happens, we have that record of who she was, who Dad was, what their love meant. Margaret finished her goodbyes and came over to me. She moved slowly with the walker, but with determination. Dr. Reyes, she said. Noah. May I call you Noah? Of course. I want to give you something. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small leather-bound journal. This is a copy of what I've written. Rebecca made copies for the family, but I wanted you to have one too. Mrs. Chen, I can't... Please. You gave me back my mind, even knowing it might bring me pain. You treated me like a person with a story, not just a diagnosis. That matters. And I want you to have this so you can remember. Every patient you treat has a story like this. A love story. A loss story. A story of how they became who they are. Never forget to look for those stories. I accepted the journal, feeling its weight in my hands. Thank you. I'll treasure this. And Noah, one more thing. When you're faced with cases like mine in the future, and you will be because confusion in the elderly is incredibly common, remember that sometimes the kindest thing isn't to let people stay comfortable in their illusions. Sometimes the kindest thing is to help them face reality, even when reality is hard. Because real grief can be processed. Real grief can be survived. But living in limbo, waiting for someone who will never come, that's not peace. That's purgatory. She hugged me then, this elderly woman who had lost her husband and her mind, and found them both again, in different ways. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet but clear. Thank you for seeing me, she said. Really seeing me, as a whole person. That's what good doctors do. I watched as Rebecca helped her mother into a wheelchair for the trip downstairs. Margaret insisted she could walk, but hospital policy was clear. As they headed toward the elevators, Margaret turned and waved, and I waved back. Dr. Chen found me standing in the hallway, still holding the journal. You did good work on this case, she said. We did good work, I corrected. You're the one who insisted on the full metabolic workup. True, but you're the one who saw her as a person first, a patient second. That made the difference. Dr. Chen glanced at the journal in my hands. What did she give you? Her story. Her and her husband's story. That's quite a gift. Are you going to read it? Yes, not right now, but soon, when I have time to really absorb it. We walked back toward the emergency department together, back to the constant flow of patients and crises and human dramas that never stopped. But I felt different somehow. Changed by the experience of watching Margaret Chen lose and find herself, by the reminder that behind every confused patient was a whole life, a whole history, a story worth knowing. 3 months later, I was sitting in my apartment on a rare evening off when I received an email from Rebecca. The subject line read simply, an update on Mom. I opened it, curious and slightly anxious. Margaret's Alzheimer's could have progressed rapidly. She could have declined. She could have, but the email began. Dr. Reyes, I wanted to give you some good news for a change. I read on. Mom is doing remarkably well. Her cognitive function has remained stable since the hyperparathyroidism was treated. She still has some memory issues, especially with recent events, but nothing like the profound confusion she had before. More importantly, she's learned to live with her grief in a healthy way. She finished her memoir last month. We had it professionally printed and bound, made copies for the whole family. At Thanksgiving, we all sat around and she read excerpts aloud. There wasn't a dry eye in the room, but they were good tears, healing tears. She talks about Dad now in a healthy way, remembering the good times, acknowledging the loss but not being consumed by it. She says that remembering clearly, even when the memories are painful, is better than living in confusion. She says she'd rather have 1 year of clarity than 10 years of comfortable delusion. The neurologist is cautiously optimistic. While she does have some degree of Alzheimer's, treating the hyperparathyroidism seems to have significantly slowed the progression. They think the elevated calcium was accelerating the dementia, and now that it's controlled, she's much more stable. But here's the most amazing part. Mom has started volunteering at a hospice, working with families who are dealing with loss. She says that her experience, both of losing Dad and of losing her memory of losing him, gives her a unique perspective. She can help people understand that grief is survivable, that even the worst pain eventually becomes bearable. I wanted you to know because you're part of her story now. You're part of what saved her. Not just medically, but spiritually. You reminded us all that truth matters, that reality matters, even when it's hard. Thank you for seeing my mother as a whole person. Thank you for not giving up when the obvious answer didn't fit. Thank you for caring enough to look deeper. With gratitude, Rebecca Chen. I sat back, letting the emails sink in. Margaret was okay. More than okay. She was thriving in her own way. She was using her experience to help others. She was living with intention and purpose, even knowing that her memory might betray her again someday. I thought about the journal she'd given me, which I'd read over several evenings. The story of James and Margaret Chen's life together was beautiful in its ordinariness. No grand adventures or dramatic incidents, just 53 years of showing up for each other, of choosing love day after day, of building a life together one ordinary moment at a time. Margaret had written in the final pages, "If I forget again, if the Alzheimer's takes these memories away, at least I'll know I honored them first. I'll know that I took the time to remember clearly, to grieve properly, to celebrate the love that made the grief necessary. That matters. That will always matter, even if I can't remember that it matters." My phone rang. It was Dr. Chen. "Noah, we've got a case I think you should see." Elderly woman brought in by her family, confused and disoriented. They say she's been diagnosed with dementia, but something about the presentation doesn't quite fit. I smiled, reaching for my keys. "I'll be right there." As I drove to the hospital through the evening traffic, I thought about what I'd learned from Margaret Chen. That confusion had causes, some of them treatable. That grief was survivable, even when it felt impossible. That truth mattered, even when truth was painful. And that every patient had a story, a love story, a loss story, a story of survival and resilience and the human capacity to endure. St. Halstead Hospital rose ahead of me, all 17 floors lit up against the darkening sky. Inside, an elderly woman was confused and scared, and her family was desperate for answers. They needed someone who would look beyond the obvious diagnosis, who would search for treatable causes, who would see their loved one as a person with a history and a story worth preserving. They needed a doctor who understood that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is help someone face their reality, even when reality includes loss and grief and pain. Because living in truth, however hard that truth might be, was better than living in the comfortable fog of forgetting. Margaret Chen had taught me that. Her husband James had died 12 years ago, but in her confusion, she'd lost not just her memory of his death, but her memory of him, of their love, their life, their story. Getting her memory back meant facing grief again, but it also meant reclaiming love. And in the end, that was worth any amount of pain. I parked and headed toward the emergency department entrance, where the automatic doors whooshed open to admit me. Inside, I could hear the familiar sounds of the ED, monitors beeping, voices calling out, the controlled chaos of medicine being practiced by dedicated people who showed up day after day to help strangers through their worst moments. Somewhere in that chaos was a confused elderly woman who needed help, who needed someone to see past the diagnosis to the person underneath, who needed someone to remember that behind every medical case was a human being with a lifetime of memories, relationships, and stories that mattered. I thought about Margaret one more time, about how she'd almost lost herself to confusion, how she'd hidden from grief in the fog of forgetting, and how she'd found her way back to clarity and truth, about how she was using her experience now to help others navigate their own losses. And I thought, this is why I became a doctor. Not to cure every disease or save every life. That was impossible, and I'd learned that early. But to see people, to really see them in all their complexity and humanity, to help them find their way back to themselves when illness or injury or age threatened to take that self away. The elderly woman waiting in the emergency bay tonight deserved nothing less. I pushed through the doors and went to work. Because sometimes the most important thing a doctor can do isn't to cure disease. It's to help people remember who they are, to honor their stories, to guide them back to truth even when truth is painful, to understand that grief and love are two sides of the same coin, and that both deserve to be faced with clarity and courage. Margaret Chen's husband died 12 years ago, but his love lived on, in her memories, in her daughter's memories, in the memoir she'd written, in the way she moved through the world. Death had taken James from her physically, but it couldn't take the story of their life together. That story was eternal, as long as someone was there to remember it and tell it. And that, I was learning, was what medicine was really about. Not just treating bodies, but preserving stories. Not just extending life, but honoring the meaning in that life. Not just curing disease, but seeing the whole person, past, present, and future, and helping them navigate toward whatever peace and clarity was possible. One patient at a time, one story at a time, one moment of truth at a time. That was the work. That was the calling. That was why I showed up day after day to the fluorescent lit halls of St. Halstead Hospital, to see people, to hear stories, to help heal not just bodies, but hearts and minds and souls. To remember that every confused patient was once clear, every grieving person was once whole, every ending was once a beginning, and sometimes, with the right treatment and the right support and the right amount of courage, people could find their way back, could face their grief, could honor their love, could live with truth instead of comfortable illusion. Margaret Chen had shown me that, and I would carry her lesson forward into every case, every patient, every story that crossed my path, because that's what good doctors do. They see, they listen, they remember, and they never ever stop believing that truth and clarity and love are worth fighting for, even when the fight is hard and the outcome uncertain. That was the promise I made to myself as I walked into the emergency bay to meet my next patient. That was the doctor I was trying to become, one day at a time, one patient at a time, one story at a time,